everyone, welcome back to Watercolor Painting. Today we're going to be doing monochromatic animals. The animal I'm going to be doing today is a whale. I'm going to be showing you how to layer one single color to create depth and just really make your animal look really cool and pop. The supplies that you need, make sure you have your watercolor paper, paintbrushes, paper towels for drying off your paintbrush as well as picking up excess water and paint, 2 cups of water, 1 for clean water, 1 for dirty water. We're going to be using a Sharpie and a pencil to draw out our animal creature. Have your watercolor paints, of course. This watercolor paint set you can get at Michael's and it lasts a really long time. It's worth the investment, but if you have the Crayola ones, that's perfectly fine as well. They will also work. I also have a paper plate. This is a 7-inch plate that I use. You can get them anywhere, and this is what I'm using for my palette. So you don't have to have any crazy equipment. This is all stuff that you can get at home, minus the watercolor paper and the paints. So let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is actually draw out the animal on the paper. You can also print out a line graphic drawing online and trace that onto your paper however you want to do it. I'm just going to draw it freehand, but if you want to just download an image and print it out onto your watercolor paper, if you have printer capabilities that can do that, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, I encourage that you draw this yourself. So you can also practice your drawing. So I'm going to do that and just watch, and then we'll carry on with the watercolors. Okay, so this whale is slightly different from the whale that I just drew that you saw. It's because I ended up doing the whole lesson on time lapse. That's what it's going to end up looking like because I have the goals of making the fin down here darker because I've got the idea that my light source is going to come from the top. This whale, in my mind, is coming closer to the surface of the water. So the way that I've painted this is I have the snout being kind of like the lighter part of the whale, and his belly is going, and his underside is going to be much darker. The inside of his fin, I don't know what this actual part of the whale is called. I'm an artist, not a biologist, but this part's going to be much darker because it's like this side of his fin is what's going to be, the light's going to be hitting it, and then there's going to be this shadow created underneath. I'm going to go through again, but this is the goal. This is the end goal of what we're going to be doing today. As you notice, my dirty water and my clean water here. You see that I've been using only one color this whole time to create this whale. So what I've been doing is using the dry on wet technique, and that's going to actually help us control where the water goes, where the paint goes, and how saturated it gets. And how we're going to start out is by grabbing some blue on our paintbrush and actually getting more water here because we're trying to dilute the color. We want to create layers of really light blue first, and then we're going to add as we go, okay? This whole whale is going to be blue at some point, but notice that some areas are darker than others. That's because we're going to add to this section much more than we're going to add to the top of the whale and his snout, okay? Or whatever, the tip of his nose, I don't know. So I'm going to start over here, and I'm going to try and work in a clockwise motion, just kind of going back and forth like this on the whale. And pretty much this whole whale is going to be blue, but varying shades of blue. The first layer is going to be really, really, really light. And I know the instinct is to put as much color on your paintbrush and get it as deep and dark and saturated as possible. But with watercolor, the best way to work is to start off really, really light and add as you go. And so for actually this part, I'm kind of mixing both the wet on dry and the wet on wet technique. I'm kind of priming my paper in some areas first. As you can see, like there's no color, but I take a little bit and I just dab a little bit of that diluted blue paint on there, and then I'm able to spread it out pretty easily. So that's like the wet on wet technique I'm using for this first part of the whale, this first layer of the blue. Now you can use a bigger paintbrush for this as well, just to get this first layer on, because it's a tedious layer, but you're able to just really get this light blue layer. Sorry, I got distracted for a second, so I don't know if my thought process actually, I don't know how that sounded. Sorry if I'm confusing you kids. Now you do notice that I drew these lines on the whale that, you know, these like kind of like scratching kind of looking sections. Now these are my markers for what parts of the whale I plan on making much darker than the rest of it. These are my shadows, okay? And I can, you know, you can pick and choose your shadows as you go, what looks best. The other part of the whale that we're going to deepen in color are going to be the lines on the underside of his jaw here and going down into his belly, because this is a very, you know, this is part of a blue whale's anatomy, or excuse me, not a blue whale, a humpback whale's anatomy. They're known for these, and you know, this is going to help us discern what kind of a whale this is in comparison to other whales. So this is important for, you know, so that everyone knows what kind of a whale you're drawing. Now I've done my first layer here. One thing that is important to note is when you're adding another layer of paint, you want to make sure that the parts that you're adding onto are as dry as possible. You can use a hair dryer and literally dry your paper. You know, you can blast, air dry your paper, and you'll be able to add the next layer on without too much issue. And the main concern is bleeding paint onto an area that you may not want more paint to go into. So this part, the top part of this whale is dry, where his mouth line, you know, divides the dry part with the part I just worked on was here. So I can add more to this area and be okay. Yeah, it's pretty dry up until this area, but I can add, and then by the time I get here, it'll be dry enough to work it. And remember, I'm only adding a little bit of paint. Notice that it's just not that much darker than the rest of this whale. And I'd rather it be this light and add more layers on later than have to try and pick up color and take away. It's easier to add than it is to take away color, which you can, by the way. When we start doing maybe the third or fourth layer, I'll show you how to handle that situation when we get to it, because it's gonna happen. Every watercolor painting gets that way. But again, I'm just using a mixture of the wet on dry, and then also doing wet on wet depending on what part of the whale I'm on. And that's the thing, is like, you don't have to be afraid to do wet on wet with layering. The only concern that I have with wet on wet with layering is if you do it too much and you don't allow a paper to dry before you do the wet on wet technique, the concern is that the paper will start to bubble, and it'll get this like little what I call like a cotton ball effect, where little like round parts of the paper starts tearing up and making your paper look like it's a blanket that's been washed too many times. So to avoid that, you want to let the paper dry before you do the next layer, and it'll really help you. The other thing that will help too is using a paintbrush technique. Instead of coloring it back and forth like you would a marker or a crayon, you can use what I like to call a dabbing technique, where let me get some colors so you can see, where you just kind of press down like you're pushing buttons, just dabbing this paintbrush onto the paper in the spots that you want the paint to go, and you can get a little bit of water to help spread the paint around a little bit. Okay, so I want to leave that section alone for a little bit. The other thing I want to leave alone for a second, I want to leave this fin alone before I work on it. I want to kind of create a deeper layer here with blue, with the shadows here. We're not going to go too dark. It'll be more dark down in this section down here, but closer to the body of the whale, this fin is going to be a lot lighter than the rest of the area. And then over here, what I'm doing, I'm not too concerned with how deep this color is, but notice that how saturated that this color is. This whale is going to be a really cool, beautiful blue color. So you can get a lot of paint on the parts that you know are going to be shadow. And then you can just add water and literally drag the paint down. Did you see how that looked? You can just drag the paint around a certain section. If you've got a lot of saturation in an area and you want to kind of even it out a little bit. So remember how dark it was just a second ago, and all I added was water and just dragged the paint down. That's the other beautiful thing about watercolor paint, is that a little goes a long way. Just adding water and dragging that paint color down. You don't have to worry too much about the paint kind of spreading out and fanning out. That's the kind of the look of watercolor. That's the style of it, is that it kind of flows where it wants to go. You just kind of allow it to do its thing. It can do really cool stuff on your paintings. This is also kind of a lesson about just, you know, kind of releasing control, or at least that much control over your paper. We want to have some kind of control because we're using dry on wet, but it's kind of like learning how to allow the paint to go where it wants to go in places that, you know, you can give a little bit, you can kind of give the paint a little bit of freedom to kind of do its thing. Like, it doesn't have to be, I tell my kids this all the time, it does not have to be perfect. Okay, I'm going to work on this part of the whale first before I come down onto this fin here, and then allow this area, excuse me, a little bit of time to dry. So we're doing another layer. And remember, not a lot of paint. This is actually kind of like the same amount of paint we've been using, and now we're seeing the color deepening with each layer that we do. The other thing that I'm staying away from adding too much color is right around the eyes. There's some kind of psychology about paintings where if you're looking at a living creature that has eyes, that's usually where a person looking at the painting is drawn to first. Now, I don't know the reasoning behind that, but I don't know. Think about that. Why do you think we look at the eyes first when we look at a painting or a picture? Especially a person, we usually look to see their eyes. Okay, I'm going to hold off on the belly for a second, and now we're going to do this next layer on the fin. And again, I don't want this to be very, very dark up closer to the body and even on this part, but towards the end, towards the tip of this fin here, I want it to be a lot darker. Not a lot, a little a lot. Now I'm not adding any more color, I'm just adding water and I'm dragging the excess paint. It's going to go where the water goes here. You can kind of already see there's a lightness here in relation to the tip of the fin. I'm going to leave it like that. Maybe add a little bit more water here. Now what I can do here, if I want this a little bit lighter, I can actually take a paper towel and pick up excess color, so you can kind of see a little bit, maybe not a lot, but you can kind of see how I've picked up some color here. And I would prefer the color to be kind of more on this end of the fin rather than up here. Okay, that's still wet. Okay, so I'm going to come up right in here. Oh, did you see how my paper popped a little bit? We got a lot of water. I'm going to need to let this dry after I do this layer. But I'm going to get some deeper color. And what I'm going to do on this part is I'm going to kind of work on the shadow, the parts I want to shade in. And one of the parts I want to shade in is the lines of this humpback whale, his chin here. And you can see that this part still has a lot of water because it's bleeding out a little bit, and that's okay, because the next layer we can do is we can add water and just kind of smooth out the way that it's webbing out like that. We can smooth that out with some water even after it dries. Now notice I'm not adding water, I'm just actually getting the straight pigment and just running it along there. And I'm doing that because I want to create the shadows and emphasize this part of the whale's jaw, because it's this is a common physical trait of the humpback whale, so we want to emphasize it so people know what you're drawing. What are you painting? What kind of a whale? I'm gonna go ahead and get this deeper, richer blue going on over here. Notice how it bled into here. Go ahead and fix that later when it dries, and we'll come back around. So you don't have to worry too much with watercolor. If we were working with acrylic, yeah, acrylic dries, and like once acrylic dries, that's it. There's no more going back and working on that section. Like you'd have to paint it over or even scrape it off. But with watercolor, you can kind of go over an area with a little bit of water and you can revive that paint. Kind of like on this palette, you know, I placed the colors on these palettes, or excuse me, like these paper plates, and I mean, I did this in, when did we have our last class? In January we started, and these paints, even though they're dry and on a paper plate, I just use a little bit of water and I can revive them. I mean, these colors have been on here since January. So that's something, that's the other cool thing about watercolor, is how long it can last. Even when it dries, it's still gonna work. Now, I kind of highlighted the barnacles here. I did that and going over the next layer, I'm just going to add water rather than adding color to those barnacles. I think that's what is on a humpback whale. I don't know what it's called. See, I added way too much pigment on this section. I want this to be a lot lighter, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some water. I'm going to take my paper towel. You're going to see this a lot better than you did on the last time, and I'm going to pick up that excess color. Okay? So that's how you remedy that situation. And I'm just going to take some more water and drag that paint around a little bit. It'll still be lighter. I can even, if you just want to do a very small portion, so notice that I did have 2 extra brushes here. You can also take a brush and also, a dry brush, and you can also pick up excess paint in like certain areas. If you don't want to use a paper towel and risk smudging, like I kind of smudged over here. You see how that works? These fins, these tail fins. So in this part, because I already have like dry color over here, I'm just going to get my clean water and I'm going to kind of smooth out the way that this color had bled a little bit. And it's okay that the edges look a little rough. You know, texture's good. Texture's a good thing. I kind of wanted to stay away from the barnacles, but I kind of messed up a little bit there, and that's okay because it doesn't have to look perfect, right, kids? Okay guys, and that is a monochromatic animal using layering and shadow and light to create depth and texture. We'll see you next week for our next lesson. We're going to be doing sorry, nature. Okay? All right, we'll see you soon.